Welcome to the Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, where we take you on a journey of what is behind the specific beliefs and behaviors that impact individuals and organizations. With our guests, we get to the root cause of what stands in the way of everything from health, wealth, and relationships to leadership, community transformation, and societal progress. From topics on leadership, psychological safety, corporate culture and communication, to parenting, trauma, relationships, personal health, and intimacy, this podcast is sure to get you to the source and provide you practical tips to transform your life one root cause at a time. I am your host, Dr. Maisha Claiborne. I'm a physician, a coach, a consultant, and an expert in trauma-informed communication. The founder of the Mind Remapping Company, I help individuals and organizations better understand the brain, behavior, and the root of false beliefs so that you can more effectively listen, communicate, connect, and create fulfilling relationships and results in your personal and professional life. Join us every Monday morning at 8 a.m. and let's get to the root cause and discover what's behind your beliefs and behaviors. Welcome back to another episode of Behind Beliefs and Behaviors. And boy, am I excited for this conversation. Ooh, I have a treat for you all. So this person that you see next to me today, and for those of you, some of you may not see because you may be listening to this podcast on the back end, but this person is just huge to me. He's a mentor. He's become a fast friend. We're collaborating. But this is Robert Dilts. Now, a lot of you may or may not know this, but Robert Dilts is one of the founders of neurolinguistic programming. He is one of the originals. He's an OG. And you all who follow me, you know that is the background of a lot of the work that I do in psychological safety and trauma-informed communication. That is the foundation that I bring in to this work. And so it is an honor. I did his trainer's training course back in, I think this is 2023. So that was 2022, I believe, 2021.
Yes. No, 2022. And then the master trainer was 2023.
And then I did the master trainer this past year in 2023. And it was just a pleasure to be able to connect. And we've done more work together and we have more work to do together. So I want to just happily introduce Robert to the stage. Thank you so much for being on the show with me. You are just amazing. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm speaking from my house here in Paris, France. So
yes.
It's a lovely day here. And how am I today? I'm super excited to be on the podcast with you. I know it's going to be really interesting and fun. And I think also useful and inspiring for the audience.
Absolutely. Well, so I always like my audience to get to know. I mean, I've done my introduction, but I like my audience to get to know my guests a little bit better. So would you mind just sharing a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, the world of that?
Sure. So as you pointed out, I was in that sort of original group of people that was starting NLP, neurolinguistic programming, back in the mid 1970s when I was a student at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And basically, was very inspired by that. That has more or less been my life path ever since then, ever since I was about 19 or 20 years old. And, in addition to working with Bandler and Grinder, worked with a lot of some of the, I think, original inspirations for NLP, like Milton Erickson, Gregory Bateson, Virginia Satir, a number of others. My sort of professional path has involved not only NLP in the area of individual work and coaching, but also I do a lot of work with teams, companies, organizations, and the DILT Strategy Group is an organization built around this notion of success factor modeling, which is a kind of an extension in a way of NLP, but looking beyond individuals to how teams, organizations, and groups work. And I think this is going to be part of what our conversation is about today. But the idea of success factor modeling is you're looking at, well, what is it that makes an exceptional or remarkable individual, team, organization? What are
Yeah.
some of the key success factors in terms of sort of these different levels of
Mhm.
what in the environment, what in what they do, what in how they think, what in
Mhm.
what they believe, which is, I know
Mhm.
is
Yep.
behind this belief, but also in the sense, in their own sense of identity, and then ultimately purpose. So, and as a result of that, I have authored now over 30 books on varieties of topics from beliefs. I have a couple of books specifically on
Mhm.
belief and on language and beliefs, this notion of what we call sleight of mouth, which is a
Mhm.
play on sleight of hand. It's about the
Yeah.
magic of language,
Yeah.
but also on leadership, on, teamwork, on health. And in fact, you and I have been also speaking about this kind of use of success factor modeling in the area of health and
Mhm.
healthcare. So I have a lot of interest, and I guess then what I do is, in addition to doing coaching and consulting, also do training, and have spent a lot of time over the last 40 years traveling to different places and
Yeah.
giving seminars, both for internal to organizations, but also to open programs to companies, and of course the NLP University, which we established back in 1990, early 1990s. So yeah, that's kind of an overview.
Very cool. I mean, I just, one of the things that I have loved about training with you, just, I had some background and then I came and I sought you out actually and trained. And one of the things that struck me was this idea of multiple intelligences.
Mhm, mhm,
And while it's, it's something that had been in my sphere over the years, I had never heard it quite
mm,
identified in that way, these
mm,
multiple intelligences.
mm.
And we're, sort of going to lead into this idea of collective intelligence. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this idea of multiple intelligences. And then, we can talk about it as it relates to leadership.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so first of all, NLP itself is kind of founded on this notion that we create our maps and models of the
Mhm,
world through
mhm,
our five senses, and
right,
each sense can actually be the basis for a different kind of intelligence. So,
mhm,
obviously we have our eyes, our ears, our bodies, our mouth, and NLP always said, well, we have these sort of primary representational systems, the language,
mhm,
imagery, feeling that we use to understand the world. But I think then the notion of an intelligence is that each of these sort of different ways of perceiving things are kind of a filter. And some filters let certain things through. They make it easier to perceive some things, and others make it easier to perceive others.
mhm,
And so for me, then the idea of multiple intelligences is that, yeah, we use our words, we use sound, we use imagery,
mhm.
we use our body. I think this notion of somatic intelligence is
Yes.
particularly important, meaning it's not just feeling in the body, it's
Mhm.
that the body itself is a form of a representational system.
That's
I
right.
can communicate with my body in the same way I could communicate with language.
Mhm.
And then this notion of metaphorical intelligence, that
Mhm.
I think this is another key, that we as humans are able to, see parallels between things. One of my teachers, Gregory Bateson, who was an anthropologist and one of the founders of systems theory, used to say, everything is a metaphor for everything else.
Oof, yes.
Meaning that, a garden is a metaphor for a person is a metaphor for a family is a metaphor for a business
Mhm.
is a metaphor for a garden,
Yeah,
music is a metaphor for all those things.
yeah.
That anything that has some kind of coherent organization
Mhm.
has similarities that we can learn from. And
Right.
I think maybe just to sort of summarize, the fundamental principle of multiple intelligences is simply that the more ways that we have to understand something, the more we understand it. If I only
Yes.
have a verbal way, I have words for it, I understand it that way, but that's not a very complete understanding. And so I
Mhm.
think this engaging of all of these intelligences gives us a much greater and richer understanding. And it's also, I think, an important foundation, as you were saying, for collective intelligence.
I love that. There's so much in what richness in just that, what you just said,
Mhm.
this space of the more ways that we have to understand something, the more we understand it.
Mhm, mhm,
And, if we look at what's going on in the world today,
mhm.
there's this very limited way that people are viewing things. They're only through single intelligence, through what
Right.
they see or what they hear. Like there's
Yeah,
this either or binary that's
exactly.
going on, this
Mhm,
exclusive.
mhm,
And we can see the impact of that in
mhm,
organizations. We can see it in the world. We can see it in the
mhm,
nation. And
mhm.
so I think, especially with technology, we have become so like in our head that we become
Mhm.
disconnected from our bodies. We're so
Absolutely.
like tunnel visioned, seeing
Mhm.
through the straw. And this idea of recognizing and acknowledging and honoring these multiple intelligences
Yeah.
as an access to understanding one another and understanding the world is just so foundational and key.
Yeah, I think you're so, so right, Maisha, that we become so disconnected from the body. And I think that's been one of the great tragedies of our time, if you will.
Mhm.
And I mean, yes, of course, technology, as you say, I mean, of course, it's allowing us to do all kinds of great things,
Yes.
but at a cost. And so, one of my favorite things to ask, my clients, or, even if I'm communicating with somebody is, can you show me that with your body? Rather than say it, show me what that means with your body. If you couldn't talk and you had to show it, what would that be? And it's
Mhm.
magical what happens, right? And it's a whole other, you get a whole completely different, representation and understanding. And usually also people come alive, when they do that. It's like, whoa, it's like, oh,
Right.
there you are. you know, wow, now I can see, this life force that's there instead of just, this kind of, I don't know, mental, I don't know, mental straw. I like your metaphor.
Right, mental straw, I like that. Mental straw. What a visual, mental straw.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's interesting because as you say that, and when we do sometimes when we do our anti-oppression work with organizations, we often are asked this question, and this is especially true, I think, with senior leadership, is that they're trained to be in their head and not in their body. And
Right.
especially when it's sort of like this sort of male dominated,
Uh-huh.
or and like that in the context of male domination, senior
Mhm.
leadership, it's like, well, how does that feel? And they're like,
What?
feeling? What do you mean? Like, what's that? How does that feel in your body? I don't feel anything in my body. Oh, well, do you feel, it's like, do you feel hunger? What does hunger feel like? Okay, that's a communication
Yeah.
from your body to your brain. And so it's just interesting to like bring that context in this whole
It's
conversation of multiple intelligences.
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember I was teaching a course and on leadership, in fact, and talking about the importance of emotional intelligence. And I
Mhm.
remember somebody actually in the course raised their hand. They said, "Well, I have an MBA in my business school. My professor said feelings have nothing to do with business. It's like, emotions have nothing to do with business. Like, well, like how do people motivate themselves? We would, there's got to be some kind of sense of emotion and feeling, and again, this sort of whole somatic dimension.
And this is going to come back around to this
Yeah.
collective intelligence. I think this is really interesting because I think that a lot of our society, but also corporations,
Mm.
have conditioned us to think that emotions do not exist in certain spaces when everyone has emotions. It's normal, it's information, and it has everything to do with every decision that is made. Like the
Yes.
idea that someone would be purely logical
Mhm.
is just very interesting and ludicrous.
I I agree. I mean, one of my favorite definitions, when I think about leadership, Maisha, I think, leading, leadership and leading, it's one of these few English words that actually has an English root. It's not Greek, it's not German, it's
Right.
not Latin. And in Old English, the lead comes from the word lethan.
Mhm,
And lethan in Old English doesn't mean power, doesn't mean
mhm,
control. It
mhm,
essentially means, to go.
mhm,
And to go, I always like to say you need two things, minimally two things. You need a direction. You don't have
mhm,
to know your destination to go. I mean, you can go
mhm,
without knowing where you're going to end up, but you
mhm,
need a direction. That's probably going to come from, one intelligence.
mhm,
The second thing you need if you're going to go anywhere is energy, right? No
Mhm.
energy, no go, right? Now,
Right.
where does energy come from?
Right.
Energy is going to come from the body, right? Energy
Right.
is going to come from the emotion, right? So
Mhm.
you need that combination. And what, I would say is that, the four fundamental pillars of all leadership is, that there's the ability to communicate some kind of a vision, a direction,
Mhm.
to inspire action, which is inspire. This is this notion of emotion, to
Yes.
encourage team cooperation. And then
Mhm.
the fourth is to be the example, right? That
Right.
leading, and again, in the early version of leadership in English, it means not just to go, but to go first, not to tell other
Mm.
people what to do, not to
Mhm.
command them, but
Mhm.
you lead by going first. So I
Yes.
think that, again, this that fundamentally says you need you need energy to do anything, and that energy is not going to come from logic.
Right.
It does not
Right.
come from reason. It's going to come from somewhere else.
And I love that you said emotion, right?
Yes.
You brought E. It's so,
Yeah.
so interesting that,
Yeah.
well, I mean, let's talk about this idea of collective intelligence, because all of
Yes.
this is playing into this concept of collective intelligence. Let's
Right.
talk about what that is.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, because by the way, again, part of, as I said, sort of that the third pillar of leadership is encouraging team cooperation. And I think
Mhm.
that's where collective intelligence comes from.
Mhm.
And I like to make the distinction generally right away between collected intelligence and collective intelligence, right?
Ooh,
So
that's good.
you can have a collection in which 1 + 1 makes 2, right? So I
Right.
put this together. In collective intelligence, you have a completely different dynamic. You get, 1 + 1 makes more than 2. It can make
Right.
3, 4,
Right.
5.
Right.
One of my sort of favorite, you know, definitions, if you will, or at least kind of expressions of it comes from Thomas Jefferson, who said, he said, well, if two people get together and they exchange $1, you
Mhm.
both walk away with $1, right? That's
Mhm.
the idea of collected. Or, I give
Mhm.
you one, you give me one. He said, if two people get together and they exchange an idea, you
Mhm.
both walk away with at least two ideas because you might have the synthesis of those
Right.
ideas.
Mhm.
And that to me is the essence of true, collectivity, that something
Mhm.
emerges. And I like to say sort of the three foundations, if you will, of collective intelligence are number one, resonance,
Mhm.
number two, synergy, and then number three, emergence. And resonance
Mhm.
means when there is something and it's usually resonance is something that is felt, right?
Yeah.
There is something that is, it's like, what is the same? Where do we connect? And that's necessary because that's where the I becomes, the me and you becomes we, right? If
Yeah.
there's no resonance, it's just me versus you. There's
Mhm.
resonance, there's something that we experience together, that we perceive, that
Mhm.
we value. So that's
Mhm.
the first step. Synergy then means we're different, so
Right.
hey, great, we each have something to contribute to
Right.
that larger, we.
Mhm.
And then emergence is, by making this contribution, we don't know what, my idea, your idea, what is that other idea? We don't know yet. It's going to
Yeah.
come out.
Yeah.
And I kind of sometimes use the image of bubbles. Let's say,
Mhm.
take the idea that an idea is a bubble, and I kind of
Mhm.
put out a bubble, you put out a bubble, and you know how bubbles where they
I love
resonate.
it.
And then there's another bubble, another one, and you start getting this thing that becomes like a molecule where you
Yeah.
can no longer see the individual bubbles and whose idea it was. What you
Right.
see is that combination, and you go, wow, so that's our creation.
Mhm.
And again, you don't know what form that's going to take. So I would say that's kind of the foundation. And then there are also some pillars, these sort of four pillars that we've
Yeah.
talked about in the past.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's beautiful how you created that, like this idea of resonance and synergy
Yeah.
and how that creates an emergence.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
that such a beautiful creation because it does speak of connectedness.
Yes.
Right? And
Yeah.
and it's sort of like at the core of everything, we talked about earlier us being disconnected from our bodies, but also we're disconnected from like from a society standpoint, we're becoming disconnected from each other. And when that happens, what it's especially in organizations, there's no productivity, there's no creativity, there's no innovation, there's no loyalty, there's, no resilience. There's not, like, all there is chaos and toxicity. And so, like, to just start with this foundation of connecting, of
Mm,
finding that resonance and identifying and honoring the synergy, and then, like, really looking to see what emerges is just, it's beautiful to
yeah.
think about, right?
It's and like you say, though, it's one thing I think it's wonderful about it is not only is it beautiful, it's much more effective.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
So
And efficient
it's
and
beautiful
efficient.
and cost effective. Meaning, and just to give an example, when this really struck me, probably almost about 20 years ago now, I was doing consulting for a very well-known international telecommunications company. It's actually based here in France. But I was called in for this to do this consulting because they had just experienced a major failure, and they were trying
Mhm,
to understand what happened. And
mhm,
the failure was this. Telecommunications is always very competitive, but that was especially a really super competitive time.
mhm,
And
mhm,
they knew that they had to develop a new product in a particular area of their market very quickly. And it was
mhm.
really, important for their company.
Yeah.
This was such an important project. They literally put 1,000 people on this project.
Mhm,
Now, the failure was that one of their competitors was able to come up with a better product, so better quality, more quickly, faster than they did, and it
mhm,
was less expensive. So they were outperformed in every key performance indicator. But the
mhm.
most astonishing thing was that this competitor did this with a team of 20 people. So the
Ooh.
question was, how is it possible that 20 people can so completely outperform 1,000? And the
Mhm,
answer was what you were just talking about. That 1,000 people was led in sort of the traditional top-down manner. A few people they kind of design it. Then you
mhm,
start to assign people. They
mhm,
work in their little silo. They don't know what
mhm.
anybody else is doing.
Right,
You just do your job,
right,
no less, no more. Uh, you know,
right.
do your thing. And so you've got these, it's like little pieces of a machine. That group of 20 people were constantly interacting. They shared a vision. Like these people, 1,000 people, person number 995 had no idea what they were doing
Right,
fit into anything else. It's just that's your
right,
job, do it.
right.
So these 20 people, they were constantly interacting. They were
Mhm,
excited. They felt
mhm,
like what they were doing together was meaningful. And if one of them had an idea, they exchanged it with others. So you were constantly getting this synergy and emergence. And
mhm.
it's just obvious in those kind of situations, 20 will always outperform
Mhm.
1,000. And
Absolutely.
it costs a lot less and it's a
Mhm,
lot more exciting and more fun. I mean, it's kind of like you say, it's sort of almost a no-brainer that this is what's going to take companies forward is
mhm.
being able to foster this degree of collective IQ, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about these pillars because what occurs for me, and I know this is one of the pillars, so I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit,
That's
is
all right.
that in order for team members to have that kind of resonance and synergy, there must be trust and safety in the group.
Yes,
And
yes,
and it's funny because I just, at the time of this recording, I had just recorded an individual podcast on behind belonging is trust and safety. So, like, you have
yes,
to have this belonging, you have to have this trust and safety. And so it kind of leads into, these we were talking about the other day offline about these pillars. And so I'd
right.
love for you to create those pillars with us.
Sure. Yeah. So those pillars are key. They're basically coming out of a number of studies. One of the main ones was done by Google,
Mhm,
and another is by MIT.
mhm,
And there's also other groups that have been looking at this so-called notion of collective IQ, right? And
mhm,
what is it that creates the best team? So the Google study was, I think they spent at least 2 years studying 800 teams. They spent something
mhm,
like $6 million. I don't know, but to try to study
mhm,
what made the best teams.
mhm.
One of the first things that was very obvious was that it was not so much about the composition of the team, meaning that same person could be on a really great team, that same person could be on a team that doesn't function very well at all. So
Mhm.
it's not about the person. It's about how they're interacting. So
Yeah,
the highest individual IQs do not necessarily create the highest collective IQs.
right.
In fact, sometimes you get sort of the opposite.
Mhm.
So what made that? So the first thing they found that seems kind of pretty obvious is what they called, equality of conversational turn taking, which just simply means that more or less, if you have an hour, with a space of that hour, if you had 5 people, each of these 5 people is roughly contributing around the same amount of time.
Mhm.
And it's kind of obvious that if only one of them is taking the whole hour, you're not getting any kind of collective intelligence. You're getting
Right.
that person's intelligence, but it's
Mhm.
not collective. So
Mhm.
some kind of equality of contribution makes sense.
Right.
Second pillar was what they called social sensitivity, which meant, okay, just like we were speaking about, it's not simply this verbal head-to-head interaction.
Mhm.
That the notion of social sensitivity is that there's actually attention to nonverbal cues, and especially those related to emotions and emotional
Mhm.
states,
Mhm.
so that you don't just keep pushing on if everybody is tired or stressed, that there's some acknowledgement made, there is some
Yeah.
adjustment made, etc. The
Mhm.
third, which is one of the keys, and I think they said that this was probably the most essential, but it also in some ways requires some of these others in a certain way, is the idea of psychological safety. That
Mhm.
is that people, as you said, they feel some sense of trust, some sense that you can speak authentically without being ridiculed, judged,
Mm.
shamed, etc.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then finally, the fourth pillar was what's known as task significance,
Mm.
meaning that what we're doing as a team is contributing to something bigger than us. That means it's not
Yeah.
just about us,
Mhm.
it's not who's the highest in the pecking order. It's
Right.
we are part of something bigger than ourselves, and what
Mhm.
we are contributing matters. And and then I think, the other part of those pillars is that they're each supported then by certain qualities of mindset.
Mhm.
So when people are contributing equally, it's because they respect each other, and they're also
Yes.
taking responsibility to speak if I'm a natural introvert,
Yes.
responsibility to let others speak if I'm a natural, extrovert.
Mhm.
The second one of social sensitivity comes from a mindset of caring for each other and interest in each other. So if
Mhm.
I'm caring and interested, then I'm going to be, sensitive to those things.
Yeah.
And then psychological safety, I think there's multiple contributions, but certainly trust is a big one, as you said.
Mhm.
For me, there's also something about acceptance, allowance,
Mhm.
and then for this notion of task significance, it's a mindset of some kind of contribution, tribute, and there's some kind of sense of meaning. So I think those are key. But again, I think as we were saying, I think probably the most important of those pillars, maybe the cornerstone, you might say, is psychological safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you said it. I think there's like a lot of these pillars, they have some of the elements they encompass. There's an
Right.
integration and an overlap with this psychological safety. I mean, if there's like the four pillars of psychological safety are, feeling included. So there's inclusion safety, and that's
Right.
encompassed in this sort of equality of turn taking or
Right, right.
including
Yes.
all voices, right? And then
Yeah,
there's like,
yeah,
learner safety, like the feeling safe to learn, to make mistakes, like allowing people to learn and grow. And then you have this element of this safe to contribute, like to be able
yes.
to be authentic, to be able
Right,
to
right.
express oneself, authentically without retribution. And then
Yeah,
I love the task significance. I think I really like that because it does connect to like the higher purpose and the
yeah,
higher vision and mission,
yeah,
and creates that sort of one mindedness,
yeah,
right? And then I think you're just exactly right with that people have to come into it with a mindset of respect, with a
mm,
mindset of personal accountability and a
mhm,
willingness to learn and grow, right? When you
mhm.
come in with that, I already know, or I call it the already always,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
When you come in with that, then it really just like shuts off the opportunity to be able to be contributed to, which is a
yes,
gift for others to be able to contribute to,
right.
another person.
Yeah, I've always said that sort of my fundamental sense of my my mission is about something like helping to create a world to which people want to belong, and that also
Mhm.
means to which they can contribute and
Yeah.
in which they can thrive. And I think these things you were just talking about are exactly that. I was just thinking one of the powerful things about task significance is that they tend to say that people who are natural introverts don't necessarily speak out.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's something bigger than you that's important, then it's not about you anymore, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
they say that leaders can be extroverts or introverts. It's not that leaders are primarily extroverts,
That's right.
but often introverted leaders are the ones that are in service of something bigger than themselves, and that's what sort of brings out that sort of gives whatever the courage and the impetus to actually speak out. And then I think the other thing that's I think is so important is this notion of listening.
Yes. Oh,
That I think
you read my mind. I was literally just thinking this. Oh my
there must be
goodness.
resonance
It
there.
is
There's a little
uncanny
resonance.
how connected.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sorry I interrupted, but
No,
that
no,
was just
no.
like I literally was thinking, man, this is speaking of listening and this,
Yeah.
and then you said it.
Well, because I think if you're not heard, it's impossible to feel safe, right? If you
Right.
don't feel that, if you're not attended to. And I was just thinking because I remember reading recently about this really interesting thing. There was a study, it was a focus group between different political people of different political persuasions. And essentially, it was kind of a disaster because all people did was just yell and argue. And at the end, they were asking them, it was interesting, what did you learn anything? And they actually, the people of any, either side, they were going, I didn't come to learn, right? I didn't come to listen. I came to be heard. But here's the problem. If nobody's listening, it doesn't matter. Then nobody's being heard, no matter
Right.
how much you shout. So
Right.
it's this kind of bizarre kind of, I don't know what to say it. It's a paradox, right? That I
Mhm.
want to be heard, so I'm not going to listen. I'm just going to yell, but then
Mhm.
nobody else feels heard. And obviously then the level of safety goes down.
Right.
So I don't feel safe to try to learn anything or listen.
Mhm.
So I do think that this basic notion of, you know, being able to be in this place where we can be receptive
Mhm.
to, other this I think this is of course obviously also the essence of synergy and
Yeah.
emergence. And of course, if there is no listening, there's not really any possibility for resonance
Right.
either. So
Right. Right. And oftentimes when I do sort of the workshops that I do on psychological safety, what I talk about is how what listening does is it holds the space. It
mm,
creates a container
mm,
for people, like it almost creates a void. It pulls for
yeah,
expression. And
yeah,
so it is not just the listening, but it's also how you listen.
exactly,
Right? Like, what is the space of listening? And so, I mean,
exactly.
we could probably do a whole master class in and of itself around listening, and maybe we should do a
Maybe we
whole
should. I think
class
maybe we
on
should.
that.
I think that is. I think that's a great idea. Let's do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that when we talk about equality of turn taking and bringing it back to like what you talked about introverts versus extroverts and
Yeah.
then psychological safety, like that core of that is this way of listening. And it's funny, not haha, but funny, interesting that when I talk about communication, sometimes it's because I take for granted that I don't know if you experience this. I take for granted that I've been doing it for a long time. Sometimes I'm like, is this too simple? But then I was
Mm,
just listening to
mm,
a book, an author, and he used this quote, common sense is not common practice.
mhm, mhm,
And so
mhm.
it just is a reminder, like if you're listening and you're like, listening, is that it? Common sense is not common practice. And
Mhm.
it's not just about hearing,
Right.
because there's a difference
Mhm.
between hearing words and actually listening.
Right. Well, you can
Yeah.
also, it's like, where are you listening from, right? You can listen just from your head. That's
Mhm.
not very deep listening, right? You can listen from the heart. You can listen from the gut. You can listen from the
Mhm.
soul, if you will,
Mhm.
and that's where I mean, that's precisely what's going to create the deeper resonance.
Yeah.
So if I'm only listening from my head, the best I'm going to get is some kind of intellectual resonance. If
Mhm.
my heart is kind of online as well, I'm going to
Mhm.
now start to get a different resonance. And I always like to say, we make this point, especially in say when you're coaching somebody, you've got to let them touch you, right? You've got to be touched by what
Mhm.
they're saying, and if you're not, nothing really good. I mean, nothing. Not that something bad is going to happen, but nothing really magical is going to happen.
Mhm.
If you can do that, though, that's where the magic starts to come from.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of magic, I mean, this is magical.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really do think, like, quite honestly, I really do think we should have a part two. We should
Let's
do
do a part two on
a,
list.
yeah, on listening. I think that is just, it's something that's so, so close to
Yeah.
my heart. And I know that you have some amazing things to say. I mean, even just in this last minute where you talked about listening from the head, listening from the heart, listening from the
Yeah.
soul, I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely a part two. So
Yeah.
you got the sneak preview here first, everyone. Well,
Yes. More to come.
yes.
More
So
bubbles.
if there's anything that you wanted to leave the audience with, just as we've talked about this idea of collective intelligence, we've talked about so many things, but as we've brought it down into this collective intelligence, is there any takeaway that you would want them to go with?
Well, I just think, there's obviously the old saying, which is that, all of us, are more effective than one of us, so I
Right.
think this is a first, why that's a fundamental principle. I think maybe also just this notion that maybe for me, the key takeaway then is, the fact that you get a group of people together is no guarantee you will get collective intelligence. As you were saying,
Mhm.
you're just as likely to get, chaos and conflict. So the same group of people can end up
Mhm.
in conflict, or they can end up doing something, remarkable.
Yeah.
We say, what's the difference that makes the difference? And I think that difference that makes the difference are sort of those pillars that we were talking about.
Mhm.
Um, that notion of
Yeah.
some kind of sense of, respect and
Mhm.
accountability, of
Mhm.
care and interest, of trust
Yeah.
and acceptance, of, contribution.
Yeah.
When people come in with that as the mindset, then some kind of magic is going to happen, and you'll move from the collection to the
Mhm.
collective.
Collective. Yeah.
And then, so I think that would be my main takeaway, that, there are certain things that we can do
Mhm.
to make it possible. And that also involves appropriate leadership. It often starts with the leader, like leader
That's
goes first. And I think that's one of the things they found in Google, was that the ability of the team leader to be, authentically expressive was one of the first things that created this possibility for, for psychological safety.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. And then if I can just, sort of add into what you just this last thing that you said around the leader being authentically expressed, I think it's important to acknowledge, oftentimes we talk about the leader has to, the leader has to. I want to acknowledge for the leaders listening
Yeah.
that also the group has to be
Yeah.
able to create the container for the leader to
Yes.
be safe as well.
Yeah.
And so, just for people who are listening, who may be like, the leader has to, the leader has to, I mean, the leader goes first. And we can all, that's part of is what you were just speaking about, creating that collective intelligence.
Mm.
We can all create safety for the leaders to be able to express themselves authentically. So I so appreciate this conversation. I
Mm.
appreciate you.
Mm.
And I'm just excited for, not just our part two, but the collaborations that we're up to as well. And
Yes.
the audience is going to have to be on a cliffhanger with that because I'm not telling yet.
Mm.
But what I would like to ask you is, for people who want to reach out to you, the Dill Strategy Group, who may want to engage in training,
Mm.
how do they reach out to you?
Well, the simplest way is, if you can remember my name, it's robertdilts.com, or, DILTS, or even simpler, NLPU.com, NLPU. They kind of both go to this same place. And then there is another website that simply is Dilt Strategy Group, all one word.com. But generally they're sort of linked together. So that's probably the easiest way.
Excellent, excellent. We will, for those listening, we have all of this will be in the show notes. And if you're listening on any of the other platforms like YouTube, look into the description. And so, are there any social media outlets that you're connected on?
Well, yeah, I have, I pretty much everything except TikTok. I don't know why, but no, I have, LinkedIn, Facebook,
LinkedIn.
Instagram,
Mhm.
Twitter, the X Twitter. Twitter, it used to be X Twitter. It's the X Twitter,
Right.
which is X. Right.
We'll make sure to include those also in the show notes. So again, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm
Yeah,
so glad that we got to have it. It was magical for me.
yeah.
And
It's a kind of a pretty interesting example of collective intelligence too.
indeed, indeed, a demonstration, indeed. And so, for our audience, I always like to thank the audience because, of course, without the audience, there is no podcast. Share this episode. This is a magic episode, y'all. You want your friends, your family, your colleagues, your community to hear this. So, share this with a couple of other people and bring to them the idea of this collective intelligence and how this can impact your community. And also, leave a review. We like to know, how this was impactful for you. So, leave a review and let us know. And until the next time we see you, please stay empowered. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We know that without the listeners, there is no podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe so you do not miss when we drop our next episode. And share this podcast with a friend, a family member, and a colleague, at least one person in your life today. This episode was brought to you by the Mind Remapping Company, helping organizations create psychologically and emotionally safe cultures that make their employees and leaders feel seen, heard, respected, welcome, and valued, all while fostering a thriving, engaged, and healthy workforce for the organization. Is your organization in need of a speaker? I speak about topics like psychological and emotional safety, trauma-informed communication, and employee well-being. If this is aligned with your organizational inclusion, belonging, or leadership goals, contact me, Dr. Maisha, by going to www.mindremappingacademy.com. That's mindremappingacademy.com. Finally, we train leaders, but we also train coaches. If you're interested in becoming a trauma-informed coach, visit our website as well and check out our NLP coach trainings and certifications. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay empowered.